And so at that point, if not for the communists, these 9 guys would have been executed by the state of Alabama, and we here, decades later in an African American history class, would never have talked about them. Because they would just be 9 more black men in the Deep South killed by the Southern justice system. And justice there probably goes in quotes, right? Like justice. Right. The communists went to defend them. The NAACP wouldn't go defend them. The NAACP avoided cases like this, like the plague. Why? Why doesn't the NAACP want to be mixed up in this?
Because they were charged of rape and then they didn't want it.
Right, because it's a sex case, right? They don't want to be using their legal resources to go defend accused rapists in the Deep South. It was the Communist Party that sent help for these 9 guys. The Communist Party hired Samuel Leibowitz, one of the greatest lawyers in the country. Leibowitz was a New York City lawyer, a Jewish American. Leibowitz had never lost a case. How's that for a badass lawyer? And Leibowitz now went down to Alabama to defend what were now labeled as the Scottsboro Boys. Maybe I should just make this clear. They were called the Scottsboro Boys all the time. The key term is the Scottsboro Boys. And yet I will try very hard not to call them that. Because what were most of them?
Men.
They were men. Right, they were men. And this whole idea of calling black men boys was everywhere in American society, right? You don't respect their manhood. You call them boys. So that's why I'm trying very hard not to do that. You call them guys or boys to men. Something. The hard part is that some of them actually are boys, you know? So it's tricky. Right, so. Leibowitz goes to small town Alabama to defend these guys. Do you think the white people in small town Alabama liked a fancy New York City Jew coming to their town?
No.
No, not at all. But in their second trial, Leibowitz did what a great lawyer does. A great lawyer is kind of part detective, you know? They find out the facts of the case. In the second trial, Leibowitz set up a model train in the courtroom. And he showed the whole jury where the black guys were riding on the train and where the white women were riding on the train. And he showed that it was impossible that they could have ever seen each other. Evidence, people. Evidence. When those 2 white women said they were gang raped, they were investigated by a doctor in Alabama. And the doctor testified in the first trial that his medical examination proved they were raped. And according to this white Alabama doctor, the proof was that he found traces of semen inside their vaginas. And to him, that was evidence that they had been gang raped. Actually, what's the only thing that proves?
They had sex.
That they had sex, right? They were not covered with bruises and scars like you might expect from a violent gang rape. So Leibowitz, part detective, right, went back and retraced the 2 women's steps before they had got on that train. And he went to the homeless camp where they had slept the night before, and he actually found the 2 white men that they had had sex with the night before they got on that train. And one of those guys came and testified in the trial. And he said, yeah, we had sex with those women. We sure did. Yeah. So he proved where the semen came from, right? Showed they couldn't have been together on the train. In any objective jury trial, he has saved these guys' lives. But who's the jury? It's white Alabamans. And are they here to hear evidence and weigh the facts?
No.
What are they here to do?
Kill them.
Right. They're here to put these guys to death. In their second trial, they were found guilty again and sentenced to execution. The communists now made these 9 guys an international protest cause. Communists in London and Paris organized big protests to stand up for 9 poor, anonymous guys in small-town Alabama. There were protests in New York City, in Chicago. So, not just around the country, but around the world. And if not for the communists, would anybody even know about these guys? Just their families. Right. And notice what the communists try to call it, right? They say that really, this is just a legalized lynching. It's doing all the same things. It's just pretending to be legal. They're lynching kids through their court system. Were people in London and Paris used to marching in the streets to save the lives of poor black Alabamans? That's new too. So all of this is really changing the way people think about black people's struggle. And once the communists had made the Scottsboro Boys into an international cause, guess who now sent lawyers to help defend them?
NAACP.
The NAACP. So the NAACP, who initially wanted nothing to do with it, now said, we'll defend you, because they didn't like the communists getting all this kind of good publicity from black people. The protests spread, and the legal battle continued. Ultimately, lawyers for the Scottsboro Boys managed to get their case twice to the Supreme Court, to the highest court in the land. And in 2 Supreme Court decisions related to the Scottsboro Boys, the Supreme Court began to expand people's rights. I guess for this to make sense, we need to remember something from long ago, the 14th Amendment. Remember the 14th Amendment, back in Reconstruction. 14th Amendment was the one that said if you were born here, you're a citizen, right? And then remember it put limits on what states could do to people, right? And one of those was that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, right? Okay. So, in this first case, in Powell versus Alabama, the Supreme Court ruled that their first trial had denied them the due process of the law. Because, was their lawyer really interested in what happened then? No, their lawyer was not competent and wasn't acting in their own interest. And so the Supreme Court said in Powell versus Alabama, every defendant is entitled to a good lawyer. A lawyer who actually cares about your case. You're entitled to quality representation. And that was the grounds on which they got their second trial. Right? Because the Supreme Court said your first trial violated the 14th Amendment. Who was the jury in all their trials?
White Alabamans.
White male Alabamans. Right. Has anybody ever been on jury duty? So here's the way it works. When you go to jury duty, there's this first thing where you're assigned to a jury pool. So there are multiple trials on that day, and you become part of a jury pool. And let's say there are going to be 12 jurors, right? The jury pool may be 35 people. And then each lawyer gets to eliminate people who they don't want to be on the jury. So the lawyers try to get people on the jury that they think will be good for their client. All right? Now, in Alabama, who are the only people invited into the jury pool? White people. Right. What's that?
White and rich.
Not necessarily, but always white and male. That part's guaranteed. So here, in Norris versus Alabama, the Supreme Court said that they had to get a new trial because black people were not allowed in the jury pool. That black people had to be allowed into the jury pool. Now, is that saying they have to be on the jury? It's not. That's saying they have to be in the room from which the jurors are picked. So then they had a third trial, and this time there were black men in the jury pool. And what then did the prosecuting attorney make sure of? That they're not on the jury. Right. But in both of these cases, the Supreme Court was really for the first time since Reconstruction starting to open up a little bit and say to the states, black people actually have some rights. You know? Not rigorously enforced equal rights, but no, they have to have a decent lawyer. You have to let them in the jury pool. The communists continued appealing these convictions. And one by one, the Scottsboro boys were released from prison. The first one released was a kid who had syphilis so bad that his sex organs didn't work. So he was physically incapable of raping anybody. They let him go first. Then they let the 11-year-old go. One by one after another. The last of them was not released. He escaped from an Alabama prison in the 1950s. That's the 50s. More than 20 years in an Alabama prison. He had basically become a bad dude in prison. It appears he didn't go to prison as a bad dude, but who are you surrounded by in prison?
Criminals.
Criminals, right. And at one point this guy had beaten up a police guard, almost killed him. So he escaped in the 1950s. And when he escaped, so all this is from a later time period, right? But he's the last one. He escaped. He made it to Michigan. And in Michigan, he outed himself. He was like, I escaped from an Alabama prison. And what then did the state of Alabama want the state of Michigan to do?
Arrest him.
Right. Give us back our prisoner. Arrest him. And in a great little moment, the governor of Michigan told the governor of Alabama, no. You never should have put this guy in prison to begin with. Can't have him back. How about that? Michigan justice. Unfortunately, that guy killed a guy in Michigan within a couple years. And he wound up in a Michigan prison, which is really kind of a bummer. I wish I could end it right there when the governor of Michigan spared him. But without the communists, all these guys would be dead, and we would have never spoken about them. And for working class black people at the time, it was this thing that made them say, those communists are all right.